The men who climbed Hill 927 said the mountain breathed differently. It wasn't wind, not really, just a steady pressure in the air that felt alive, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Firebase Ripcord was being rebuilt again. The same ridge the engineers had once called unfit for living. They said the soil shifted too easily, that foundations slid even when no rain fell. But orders were orders, and the helicopters came anyway, lowering crates and timber into the mist. By noon, the sound of hammers and engines replaced the jungle's voice. By night, the hum of generators spread across the dark like nervous heartbeat. No one spoke much about the last crew who'd tried to build here. Most of them were gone or scattered to other units. Still, when the ground gave a faint sigh under the tents, every man paused for a moment, listening to decide whether it was settling Earth, or something else learning to breathe beneath them. They came with the same calm resignation found in men who had learned not to expect the ground beneath them to behave. Most were barely 20, carrying more experience than their faces should allow, sunburned, quiet, and efficient. The orders were clear. Reoccupy Firebase Ripcord, rebuild the perimeter, restore the guns. No speeches were given. They moved like workers, not warriors, hauling timber through mist, wiring claymores along the slopes, marking the same defensive rings drawn months earlier by another platoon. At night, the valley below flickered with distant artillery, flashes soft as heat lightning. They'd sit near the sandbags, sharing powdered coffee, trading old rumors, how the last crew had left without explanation, how one of the bulldozers vanished after a storm. It was the kind of talk soldiers used to fill silence, to keep from listening too hard to what the earth might be saying. One sergeant, grizzled and almost gentle, muttered while checking his rifle, "Don't dig too deep here." No one laughed. The wind was thin that night, almost metallic, carrying the smell of oil and rain that never arrived. In the dark, the camp lights looked fragile, floating on a hill that didn't seem fully awake. The men turned in, one by one, each pretending sleep came easy while the soil shifted quietly beneath their cots. The maps showed elevation, vegetation, and safe approach routes, but none marked what truly lived beneath. When the engineers began driving stakes into the slope, they hit hollow pockets of air, each one deeper than the last. The sound was wrong, an echo instead of a thud. Later, someone found a faded French survey chart from the 1930s. Its ink bled thin by humidity. It mentioned abandoned mining tunnels winding below the ridge, their entrances sealed during the colonial retreat. No one at Ripcord had seen them, but the thought lingered. The entire firebase rested on old scars. A corporal joked that the mountain had lungs, that it just needed to exhale now and then. The laughter that followed was thin, more habit than humor. Beneath the administrative calm, a quiet unease began to form, small and invisible, like a hairline crack spreading under paint. The operations officer dismissed it all: terrain instability, simple erosion. But his hands stayed clenched on the map's edges long after the others left. That night, as fog moved over the hill, the ground gave a faint tremor no one recorded. The sound it made wasn't thunder. It was softer, almost polite, like the earth clearing its throat before deciding what to swallow next. The first tremor came so softly that most of the men mistook it for imagination. It passed through the camp just after midnight, a ripple that made the canteen sway and the loose shells shiver inside their boxes. No one called it an earthquake. It was too brief, too precise, like a single breath taken by the mountain itself. The sentries on the north perimeter swore they saw dust lift from the sandbags, though the air was still. When daylight returned, there were no cracks, no damage, just an odd pattern in the soil, a smooth ring pressed flat, as if something round had shifted beneath the surface. The radio operator logged nothing unusual. The engineers chalked it up to thermal expansion. Yet that night, one private wrote a quiet line in his letter home. "Sometimes it feels like the ground here is breathing." He underlined it once, folded the paper, and never mentioned it again. By morning, the tremor had become a story that no one quite believed. The officers dismissed it during the briefing. No seismic record, no threat, end of discussion. So the men folded the moment into their routines, pretending nothing had happened. They worked through the haze of heat, tightening bolts on artillery mounts, checking perimeters, cleaning rifles that never stayed clean. The sound of metal on metal replaced any talk of the moving ground. Someone hung a small sign near the mess tent that read "Charlie's Mole," a joke meant to swallow the unease. It worked, at least for a while. The nickname spread, and every strange vibration became the mole digging again. At night, Laughter came easier around the stoves. They brewed instant coffee, burned it black, and listened to distant explosions roll through the valley like thunder pretending to be weather. In the half-light, smoke curled against the tarps and drifted upward as if the air itself were tired. No one spoke of the silence between blasts. The way sound seemed to vanish for a heartbeat before returning. There was a comfort in repetition, in the illusion of control. The mind learns to fold fear neatly, to stack it beside rations and routine. By the fourth night, when the ground gave another small shudder beneath their boots, no one even looked up. They only steadied their cups and kept talking. It was near dawn when the patrol found it, a shallow crater just beyond the southern wire, wide enough to hold a jeep. The edges were sharp, untouched by erosion, as if the explosion had happened hours earlier. But no one had heard artillery that night, and the sensors showed nothing inbound. They marked it, took photographs, and moved on. When they returned at sunrise, the crater was gone. The soil had risen smooth, compacted, not washed or drifted, but pressed, like breath held beneath a blanket. Confusion turned to irritation. The engineers dug samples, tested moisture, even accused the patrol of misreporting coordinates. Yet the spot was there, faintly discolored, perfectly level. One corporal insisted he'd seen it happen, though no one believed him. "The dirt moved," he whispered, "like something pushing up." They laughed at first, but he didn't join in. That evening, while they stood near the refilled patch, a low vibration rolled under their boots, gentle, patient, alive. It lasted only a second, too long to ignore. The captain said nothing, just tapped ash from his cigarette and ordered them back to post. The ground, when they left, seemed to settle again, quietly satisfied. Later, when the reports were typed, the incident was labelled erosion anomaly. The file was stamped, signed, and forgotten, as if words could pin still something that refused to stay still. The wind left without warning. One evening it simply stopped, and the jungle below froze with it. The usual drone of insects, the restless hiss of leaves, gone. What replaced it was an absence so complete that even breathing felt intrusive. The men noticed first through habit. They looked for movement in the grass to gauge direction, but nothing stirred. The flags hung straight down, motionless like fabric dipped in wax. Radios began to hum faintly, a soft static that pulsed in time with no signal. When the medic checked the ground temperature, it read several degrees warmer than the air, as though heat was seeping up from underneath. They called it a weather pocket, an inversion layer, something that could be graphed and ignored. But as darkness settled, the silence stayed, thick, weighty, full of its own rhythm. One man said it felt like being watched by the air itself. He said it quietly, almost kindly, like a man apologizing to the night for noticing it breathe. Private Henders drew the late watch, the kind that stretched time into something heavy and dreamlike. The air was thick enough to taste, metallic and still. He sat near the sandbags with his rifle balanced across his knees, watching the fog drift over the perimeter lights. It was the sort of night where sound seemed to fade before it reached the ear. The jungle below looked painted, flat, unreal, like a photograph that might blink if one stared long enough. Then the soil moved. Not a quake or a tremor, just a ripple, one line running under the surface, slow and deliberate, bending the moonlight as it passed. Henders froze. The movement crossed no more than 20 feet before dissolving into nothing. He listened for the echo of artillery, for any mechanical cause, but the silence held. When he finally exhaled, his breath sounded too loud, as if it might draw attention. He waited 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour, watching the same patch of earth that refused to move again. In the morning, he said nothing. He just handed the next sentry the watch schedule and went to clean his rifle. Later, in the radio tent, he told the operator what he'd seen. Not a confession, more like a test to see if words would make it less strange. The operator nodded once and said, "The ground here does that sometimes." Neither man smiled. Both pretended it was a joke and went back to work. The night was drowned in fog so dense it turned light into smoke. Somewhere near the center pit, the mortar crew worked by lantern glow, their voices low and even. It was routine maintenance: adjust elevation, clean the tube, reset the base plate. Then, without sound or warning, the metal began to sink, slowly at first, then steadily, as if the ground had softened just beneath it. One man reached to steady it and felt the soil give under his palm, warm and pliant, like breath exhaled through dirt. They stepped back, watching in disbelief as the tube slid lower until only its rim showed. Within seconds, it was gone. No splash, no collapse, just absence. The men circled the spot, waiting for something to break the silence. The surface was perfectly level, faintly pulsing with heat. They marked the coordinates, called it in, and waited until dawn. When light finally came, the tube stood upright 20 feet downslope, clean and dry, no trace of soil on its surface. The captain logged the report as equipment displacement via unstable terrain. No one argued, but that evening, as they passed the location again, each man kept his distance. The fog had lifted, but the ground seemed to breathe slower there, as if tired from the effort of pretending nothing had happened. The recon team moved out before dawn, when the mist still hugged the trees like low smoke. Their orders were simple: survey the southern ridge for possible enemy approach routes. By midday, they found something that wasn't on the map: a depression in the slope, ringed with collapsed timbers and rusted metal. When they cleared the brush, an opening appeared, narrow, steep, framed by wood too old for the war they were fighting. The supports were European, the grain thick and blackened by humidity. Inside, the tunnel breathed a deep, damp air that smelled of copper and stone dust. They stepped a few feet in, flashlights grazing the carved initials of long-dead miners, French markings half swallowed by mold. Along the walls ran strange circular impressions, not carved but pressed, as though something heavy had rolled through long ago. The sergeant ordered photographs, then told them to seal it and move out. None of the men argued, though each looked back once before leaving. In the report, the coordinates were logged. The discovery labelled abandoned colonial structure. But that night, around the camp stove, the men spoke in quieter tones. One said he'd felt air rising from the shaft, steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Another claimed he'd heard a sound, a deep drag, faint and patient, like the earth shifting its weight far below their boots. Weeks later, an engineer stationed at a rear logistics post received a transfer file from Ripcord. It contained soil density charts, vibration logs, and a handwritten note clipped to the corner. Possible subsurface anomaly. The engineer, a man trained to think in numbers, compared readings from seismic stations along the valley. Nothing matched. The ground beneath Ripcord registered movement, but not the kind caused by artillery or tectonic shift. The pulses were too slow, almost measured, like the rhythm of something alive conserving energy. He documented everything, careful and calm, until his conclusions began to sound less like science and more like speculation. In the margin, he wrote a single line: non-geological cause suspected. The report was filed the next morning and quietly sealed. Months later, after the Firebase fell, the document resurfaced in an archive under miscellaneous structural concerns. The final page bore an annotation from an unnamed officer. No seismic record matches observed vibration. Recommend omission from review. The engineer never mentioned the file again, but colleagues remembered how he'd pause sometimes while speaking, as if listening to a noise only he could hear, small, deliberate and distant, like something steadying itself far underground. Henders went back to the tunnel before dawn. Moving alone, his footsteps softened by wet grass. The fog clung low, turning the landscape into a single grey breath. He carried no weapon this time, only a flashlight and a quiet sense of obligation. The entrance was smaller than he remembered. The wood warped inward as if the hill was slowly reclaiming it. Inside, the air was cool and close, humming faintly. Not sound exactly, but vibration, a steady pulse that felt more heard through bone than ear. He crouched near the first support beam and pressed his palm to the wall. The ground was warm. From somewhere deeper in the dark came a noise like chains being dragged through mud, drawn out and rhythmic, fading and returning as though something large turned over in sleep. Henders stayed still, unsure if he was hearing with his ears or through the soil itself. When the sound stopped, he felt the air shift, a slow exhale that brushed dust across his boots. He backed away, step by step, until the daylight found him again. At the top of the slope he looked back once and saw the mist drifting into the tunnel, folding itself inward. Later that day, he told no one what he'd heard. He only marked the location quietly on his map and never walked that ridge again. The radio tent was always the last place to sleep. Machines whispered there even when switched off, a low current hum that sounded like breathing through static. One night, near 0200, the operator tuned across frequencies to check for enemy chatter. Instead, he heard his own voice. It came 6 seconds after transmission, his words repeating back through another channel, softer, thinner, as if buried under layers of dirt. He tested again. Same delay, same echo. He called it a feedback loop, blamed bad wiring, but when the equipment chief ran diagnostics, everything read normal. The repetition continued through the week, faint but consistent, each broadcast mirrored by its ghost. Some nights the echo carried slight differences. An extra word, a pause, a whisper like wind slipping between syllables. Someone joked that Ripcord had learned to talk back. No one laughed long. When they finally logged the interference, they labeled it signal reflection, origin unknown. The report ended there, but the operator noticed something small. The echo was growing fainter, not weaker, like a sound being absorbed. The meeting took place in a canvas tent that smelled of wet canvas and paper ink. A single bulb hung over the table, swaying with every faint tremor that passed through the ground. The colonel sat at the head, his expression steady, hands folded neatly on a folder stamped "Classified." Around him the officers waited, boots dusty, faces drawn from lack of sleep. The communications officer began his report. Minor interference, irregular vibrations, unverified field observations. His voice was calm, but his knuckles stayed white against the clipboard. When he mentioned the delayed radio transmissions, the colonel didn't look up. He only asked, "Operational impact?" "None, sir." "Then it's not our concern." A pause stretched between sentences, long enough for them to hear the low pulse beneath the tent floor, faint but definite. The colonel's eyes shifted once toward the dirt, then back to the folder. "We keep the hill operational," he said finally. "If it moves again, we move with it." No one understood what he meant. The sentence hung there like an unfinished order, impossible to question. The meeting ended without further notes. Outside, the men returned to their duties. Only the colonel remained seated, watching the canvas ripple slightly where the ground met the wall, as though something beneath were breathing in rhythm with his own. On July 23rd, the sky above Ripcord burned in artillery flashes so constant they looked like lightning trapped in the clouds. Evacuation orders came at dusk, quiet, direct, stripped of ceremony. The men packed fast, moving through the smoke that smelled of clay and cordite. Down the slope, the jungle shimmered with heat and distant gunfire, but inside the perimeter, the air felt strangely calm. The generators had been shut down, yet a hum persisted underfoot, faint but steady, following their steps like an echo. Henders was among the last to leave. He paused at the edge of the LZ and glanced back toward the center pit where the mortar tube had vanished weeks before. The soil there looked smooth again, a darker shade of brown, almost wet. Over the radio, a final transmission broke through the static, a voice barely recognizable, repeating coordinates, then falling into a whisper that stretched too long to be human. The recording later captured only noise, but some claimed to hear words buried inside it. To most ears, it was nothing more than distortion. To others, it sounded like two simple syllables, still moving. When the last helicopter lifted off, the sound faded. The hill was left empty, silent except for that low vibration that came and went like breath, the kind that could only be heard when no one was listening anymore. In the official reports, Firebase Ripcord ended with coordinates and casualty counts. No mention of tremors, no record of strange soil. The line read simply, "Unfavorable terrain conditions contributed to withdrawal." The war moved on, and the hill was left to the jungle. Years later, the documents were declassified, brittle with mildew, their ink faded to the color of old rain. Historians found gaps that made no sense, missing logs, redacted names, references to geological surveys that no archive contained. Among the veterans who survived, few spoke of Ripcord at all. When they did, it was softly, with that distant calm of men remembering a place that still remembers them. One of them, older now, half deaf from shelling, returned decades later. He followed the old ridge road until the forest swallowed it, until the trees grew thick over what once was steel. At the summit, he found no trace of walls, only a clearing rimmed with ferns. The air was still, heavy with the smell of wet earth. He knelt, brushed away leaves and felt the ground, warm, steady, faintly pulsing. It might have been his heartbeat, it might have been the hill. For a moment, he thought he heard the murmur of generators, distant and patient, breathing somewhere beneath his knees. He didn't stay long. When he rose to leave, the forest seemed to close quietly behind him, as if reclaiming the memory. The road back was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't follow but waits, as though something beneath was listening, marking the sound of his footsteps fading away. They never gave it a name, and maybe that was mercy. Years later, when the narrator speaks, it is without bitterness, just the calm weight of someone who has learned that not every mystery demands explanation. He tells it like a field note. The ground had patterns, almost breathing, and when men built too close, it shifted to make room. If something lived beneath Ripcord, he says, it never meant harm. It only reminded us we weren't the first to claim this place. The tone is quiet, respectful, the way one might speak of weather or time. The story lingers on what remains, the steady rhythm of earth, the return of insects, the soft hum of growth where steel once stood. Crickets sing where mortars once fell. Grass covers the paths carved by boots that believed the world beneath them was solid. When the wind moves, it carries the scent of rust and rain, and for a heartbeat, the soil seems to breathe again. The narrator pauses before the final words. You can almost hear the night settle around him. The gentle chorus of unseen things living their quiet lives below and above. Some grounds remember who walked over them, he says at last. The recording ends there, fading into ambient noise, wind, faint static, and the long, slow pulse of silence. It feels less like an ending and more like the land exhaling, content at last to be left alone.